Professor Pinson, thank you very much for joining our interview series.
Thank you very much for having me.
Let me start right away with the first question. How has the rise of right-wing populism in Israel shaped curriculum design, educational policy, and civic education? In what ways does this curricular engineering affect how younger generations understand Gaza, Palestinian society, and the broader conflict?
Okay, so let me start that populist discourse in the past decade, or even more than a decade, have greatly influenced curriculum and education discourse, both in high school and schools in general, but also in higher education institutions. It's a bit speculative to try and think how it shaped views of Gaza, but let me just give you a few examples of how this sort of populist discourse has manifested itself when it comes to education. So just an example from this week, actually. We just learned that the civic education curriculum, the matriculation exam for next year, will not basically the discussion of liberal democracy, human rights, and etc. won't be part of the matriculation exam. So it's not, it doesn't say that it's actually removing it from the curriculum, but every year the Ministry of Education will give sort of the main focus of this year. So it means it's not part of the focus. And on the other hand, when it comes to the definition of Israel as a Jewish state, its commitment to the Jewish people, other models of democracy, which the textbook refer to, or the curriculum refer to in various ways, but I will term as illiberal democracies or illiberal democratic models, are being emphasized at the expense of talking about liberal democracy, multiculturalism, civil and human rights, and so on and so forth. And this is for sure a kind of a reflection of the type of populism that is characteristic to Israel, which tend to sort of, I would say, put more weight on the definition of Israel as a Jewish state rather than its definition as a democratic state, and reduce its democratic nature to sort of very thin type of model of democracy. And these sort of changes, we see them being constantly reflected in school curriculum. But I would say that this shift of weight from Israel as Jewish and democratic, or democratic and Jewish, to Israel as a Jewish first, and then only democratic state when it fits and doesn't contradict it's being Jewish, is something that has been, for the past decade and a half, I would say, completely been normalized within education discourse and the production of knowledge in education. And it started with a significant change to the civic curriculum, but also other changes like the complete erasing of the green line from geography or from history textbooks, and in a sense also normalizing settlements in the West Bank as proper part of Israel. And I'm quite certain that if you ask the kind of the average high school student in Israel, or the average even undergraduate graduate in Israel, they won't necessarily understand or know that, definitely not where is the green line, and also not that I'm not sure how aware they will be to the fact that for example, a place like Ariel is on occupied territory, or that they will use the language or acknowledge the understanding of occupied territories, which, in my generation, people might have argued whether we need to continue occupy or not, but there was not, it wasn't it was clear to everyone that it's something that we need to, it's open for debate, and sort of there has been a normalization of Israel occupation to the extent that it doesn't seem by most people nowadays as occupation, and that for sure has a ramification also to how the conflict in Gaza is being and the war in Gaza is being understood in education, or being discussed, if at all, in education today.
Right. The exclusion of NGOs, such as Breaking the Silence, and growing pressures on left-leaning academics point to shrinking intellectual pluralism. To what extent do these measures reflect a broader populist strategy to control knowledge production and suppress dissent?
Okay, so I want to even in a bit broaden the discussion, not just about knowledge production, but how the sort of action, like exclusion of NGOs, like Breaking the Silence, or the Forum for Grieving Families and other left-wing organizations, or human rights organizations from school, as in a sense, I see it as an example of how the boundaries of legitimate discourse within the Israeli education system are being redrawn. And so it's not just about the knowledge production per se, which mostly happened in around structuring the curriculum, but also, I mean, what sort of discourse, what sort of politics we expose students. And in that respect, the boundaries have significantly changed and redrawn, both before October the 7th, but also even more profoundly in the past 2 years. And there are several practices that are being employed by right-wing populist organizations or politicians. And first, it's actually trying to portray those like Breaking the Silence and other as traitors. Okay, they're traitors. They are, and especially at time of war, they are even to the extent are being seen as supporters of terrorism or enabling terrorism, and in that way, I mean, if you don't want to be associated with support of terrorism, you need to kind of distance yourself from such a discourse. And in a way, so it's not only just how the boundaries of the discourse have been changed, but also what is considered a legitimate political conversation within schools. So what you're allowed to question and what you're not. And just to give you again, I mean, this arena is constantly being shaped and reshaped and changing. And I'm going to give you an example just from the last 2 weeks. So one example is that there was a group of school head teachers and a group of high school teachers who issued a video calling for the end of the war, criticizing the government for continuing the war, expressing concern about the humanitarian crisis in Gaza and the death toll in Gaza and starvation, and obviously the release of the hostages. And the first video was about, I don't know, 20 headmasters, head teachers, sorry, that published this video. They were all called for a disciplinary, I wouldn't say hearing, it's not like an official process, but they were called to the Ministry of Education and they were apprehended. I mean, they basically they were warned that they sort of I would say, crossed the boundaries of what is, as educators, what they're allowed and not allowed to say. And same goes for the teachers. And then on September the 1st, the day the school year in Israel is starting, that there was a strike organized by students in several schools, again calling for the end of the war, release of the hostages, end of the suffering in Gaza, and it was actually mostly focused on the campaign in Israel at the moment for stopping the war and the release of the hostages, which is again kind of ongoing and growing in the past few months, and that the response of the Minister of Education, Yoav Kish, first he instructed schools to mark in the personal file of the students who went on strike that they were absent. So there was a kind of a punishing element to it. But he also addressed the students, publicly addressed the students who went on strike and said that in their strike, they're actually jeopardizing the unity of Israeli society, and they are divisive and undermining kind of national unity. So this is sort of the how it's not on it for me. It feels like not just feels like, but my assessment as someone who look at how populism affect both the school system and higher education, that we see and the space of criticism and the space of democratic discourse being narrowing and narrowing constantly. And if a year ago it was more mainstream to talk about the hostages, so now when you talk about the hostages in combining with the call for to end the war because it's a political war, then you are considered as doing within the education system as saying something that is beyond the legitimate discourse, or beyond what the Ministry of Education is trying to construct as legitimate discourse. And if I can give you just one more example for that, so it's not only schools, but also higher education institutions that are kind of in this sort of in collision with this attempt of different populist agent to restructure the public spheres. And so again, 2 weeks ago, or less than 2 weeks ago, there was a day of strike in the entire declared by the campaign to end the war and to release the hostages, and many university professors, including the heads of most of Israeli universities, declared that they're going to go on a personal strike. And again, the Minister of Education response was to instruct the Ministry of Finance to fine them a day of work for striking to end the war. And this, so again, so you see this sort of measurements and sort of that definitely, especially when it comes to head teachers and teachers that are more vulnerable than university professors, then those sort of actions are definitely acting as a cooling effect.
Right. How has Israeli public opinion evolved throughout the Gaza war, and to what extent do these shifts reflect deeper sociopolitical cleavages within Israeli society, such as ethnic, ideological, or generational divides?
Okay, so I mean, this is a very good question, and there is some evolution in how Israeli public responds to the war, and to some extent, I mean, there isn't. I mean, and I'll try and explain what I mean by that. So definitely, the support of the war, I mean, is more heavily. I mean, the war itself is more heavily criticized. I think large part of the Israeli Jewish population understand, or this is what public polls showing, that they do see the continuation of the war as political, in a sense that serving the interest of the current government, and in particularly of Benjamin Netanyahu. In this sense, there is an evolution in terms of, if a year ago, or even, and definitely after October the 7th, I think the majority of Israeli public thought that the war is justified, it's the only solution, this is what needs to be done. Now there is sort of more critical understanding of the continuation of the war. There's people are critical of the burden that many reserve soldiers are paying in terms of as a price of the continuation of the war, and people are very concerned about the fate of the hostages as the war continues. So in that sense, I mean, there is a big change in public opinion, but what hasn't changed much, or not to that extent, is the ability of the Israeli public to actually understand, see, or be critical of what's going on in Gaza. So I think, I mean, the Jewish public opinion can be, the Jewish Israeli public opinion can be divided into, I mean, I'm putting aside those who, from the far right, who support the sort of the continuation of the destruction of Gaza, and they're, you know, kind of tapping into a Trump dream of building I don't know, Riviera in Gaza, once it will get rid of everyone who lives there. So I'm putting them aside. I think the majority of the Jewish Israeli public is either in complete denial to what's going on in Gaza, or in a way apathy towards what's going on in Gaza. So in that respect, I'm not sure how much public opinion have changed. I mean, there are some cracks. I think there is more attempts of left-wing activists and organization to actually bring the issue of starvation, of the death toll, the destruction into public sphere. But there's a lot of also either disbelief that this is really what's happening in Gaza. I heard you know, comments like, okay, the reports about the starvation, it's all AI, it's fake, and so on and so forth. To people who say, yeah, this is very regrettable, but it's their fault. It's their fault because of October the 7th. So, I mean, or even saying more harsher things like, after October the 7th, I lost all ability to be compassionate about the other side, which for me, it's something that I find extremely difficult to hear and to accept. But I think this is part of the ongoing processes in Israeli society that started way before October the 7th, and we see the results now. And I would say that obviously, I mean, there is a great correlation between people who, before October the 7th, were on the streets protesting the judicial overhaul, and the action that the current government were taking against the Supreme Court and other gatekeepers of democracy, and those who are now protesting against the continuation of the war. Again, not necessarily because they believe there is a humanitarian crisis or they care about the humanitarian crisis, but because they think that it's against our own interests and it's jeopardizing our country, our democracy, and so on and so forth.
Right. To what degree has the Israeli media ecosystem, spanning state-controlled outlets, private mainstream channels, and social media, contributed to the construction of competing truth regimes around the Gaza war? Are we witnessing a process of epistemic polarization that reshapes how different public understand the conflict?
Yeah, so I mean, first, I think that the mainstream media, let's start with the mainstream media. The mainstream media completely failed its job in kind of exposing the Israeli public to the full picture of what's going on, and including the costs for everyone. So I think for the better part of the first at least year and a half, there were very rarely any reports of what's going on in Gaza. And I mean, and if there were reports from Gaza, it was always like from the perspective of the soldiers. So you have like a reporter or reporters joining one of the units that are serving in Gaza.
Embedded journalists.
Yeah, Israeli journalists, and always all coordinated by the IDF spokesperson unit. So I think the majority of the Israeli public weren't really exposed to what's going on in Gaza. And even now, when there's a bit more discussion and a bit more exposure, then it's done in a very sort of, I would say, limited way, and also within a very specific narrative that doesn't put the blame on anything on the actions of Israel. So just to give you an example, I don't remember the exact phrasing, but when the international reports and about the starvation in Gaza started to appear, so one of the Israeli channel, I think it was channel 13, reported that it was kind of revealed, exposing that the majority of the children who died of starvation had pre-medical conditions that probably contributed to them dying from starvation. Now, I would look at it and say, okay, that it makes sense that the most vulnerable one will, be affected by starvation before, children that don't have pre-medical conditions. But the way it was framed was like, hey, here we revealed the big lie. There's no starvation. People are not dying of starvation in Gaza. But actually those who died from starvation were, it wasn't because of the starvation, it was because they were anyway had a pre-medical condition. And was in a way saying to the Israeli public, hey, look, it's kind of strengthening the narrative that this is not our fault. Okay, we have no responsibility. And again, as I said, I mean that when it comes to social media, so it's like I mean, I feel almost sometimes I feel like I'm in my own bubble, because that this is the way social media works. So I see reports and I see reports of the destruction in Gaza, and I'm exposed to this sort of information, and the majority of my social media friends or followers or the people I follow are in agreement with me. But when you look a bit outside, so you'll see, and I heard it from people at the university who I would consider smart, critical people, that will say, this is fake news, this is AI. The starvation kind of photographs are all AI generated. There's no real starvation. The great disbelief to what the reports that are coming from Gaza, and a lack of critical, I would say, questioning of like, how come we don't get independent reports from Gaza, for instance? I mean, this is a question I would like my student to ask. I mean, why we don't know, and so this is something that we see a great, as you described it, epistemic crisis in a sense, or polarization between those who 100% believe and exposed to what's going on in Gaza and what's going on in the rest of the world, and also and on the other hand, those who are in kind of are completely blind or in denial to what's going on. And I'm just going to give you this polarization is also, I mean, I mean, you can find it also in sort of in political activism in the street. So in the past, well, several months already, there was, I think, 6 months, there's an initiative in Tel Aviv, in the big demonstration, the weekly demonstration against for the release of the hostages and against the continuation of the war. There's a group of growing people actually that stand with photographs of children who were killed in Gaza. And this is amidst a crowd that is there to say that, you know, they're against the war. And in that instances, I think that it made people think, and it made people reflect. Okay, maybe it's not just our suffering. But when this sort of I don't know, vigil went to other parts of the city, okay, not during the demonstration, the weekly demonstration against the war, and I stood in those sort of vigils, that the level of contempt and hatred that it attracted, because it put a mirror in front of people in Israel, that okay, they'll be standing with photographs of children, and then the responses will be like either disbelief or you're Hamas supporters. Well, even if they are children, they will grow up to be Nukhba, and they will grow up to do the next massacre. So and again, so there's sort of the movement between denial and justification, okay, and for the lack of better word. And then I'll just give you another example. So there's also a campaign against the starvation, which it's a vigil. We stand holding empty pots and pans in the street, and there was a video released 2 days ago of about 15 chefs and restaurateurs who were standing again with empty pots and pans and calling for the end of the starvation. This was like 2 days ago. The chefs of these restaurants have been under attack for the last 3 days, 2-3 days. Their ranking in Google dropped because people are condemning them for, you know, again, anything you say that express concern and empathy is immediately in the public discourse. Even among those who are objecting the war are seen as coming at the expense of caring for our hostages, caring for our own kind, and immediately is being framed as, you know, you support the other side. So you can't, again, you can't be compassionate about both.
Right. Massive protests against Netanyahu's government predated the Gaza war, but have intersected with it in complex ways. How do these demonstrations reveal competing conceptions of democracy in Israel, and do they indicate a growing rift between the state policy and societal norms?
So yes, I think that the short answer is definitely yes. I mean, you do see the sort of and I mentioned it, I think, before, the sort of polarization, the polarization that we experienced the year and a half before October the 7th around the judicial reform was in a sense, in a way, is translated also to how people understand the government policy with regard to the war, with regard to the hostages, and also lots of connections that are being made between the sort of attack of the government on the Supreme Court, the government general attorney, and other democratic institutions, and again, how the continuation of the war is serving this sort of an agenda and trying to, in a way, reconstruct Israeli regime into illiberal regime. And going back to populism and the first question you asked me, I mean, we can see that many justification that the government uses is drawing exactly on this sort of populist discourse of us against them, of the will of the people, the true people, and those who are kind of being singled out as the enemy within, or the objective enemy, and so on and so forth. So we do see these sort of practices used both when it comes to the judicial reform and also when it comes to the justification of the continuation of the war.
Right. How does international criticism, including accusations of genocide by prominent scholars and institutions, shape Israeli public opinion and elite discourse? Do external pressures generate defensive consolidation around government narratives, or do they stimulate critical reflexivity among Israeli publics?
So, well, this is something that I find very difficult to respond to. I mean, first I would say, and let me focus even more on the cause for academic boycott of Israel. And let me say that to begin with, that I understand why people, my colleagues in other places around the world, or why university students, or why academic association feel that they need to do something about what's going on in Gaza. This is whether we will put whatever label we'll put on it, genocide or not. I mean, what's going on in Gaza is of a scale that is unimaginable, and I wouldn't like to see people, kind of being silenced globally in the face of what's going on in Gaza. But then, I mean, when I look at the sort of how this sort of criticism is being perceived in Israel, it's more complex than that, and the political effectiveness of that is problematic. And just to explain, there's sort of I would say a catch-22. So I spoke about how Israeli media and how Israeli public perceive what's going on in Gaza, and the sort of the movement of the majority of the public between denial and apathy and justification, but with great, in a sense, there's no sort of self-reflection or responsibility. So when this narrative is so strong, and it is a very strong narrative, even among, as I said, even among those who object the continuation of the war, then when you hear that people, organizations, states are asking to sanction, to boycott Israel, the way that it is being interpreted is, okay, here again, this is another proof of the world is against us. And I had numerous conversations with people who I have great respect towards, and they would say things like, Israel is being held to higher standards, and this is why we are attacked. This is, and obviously the argument that this is no more than, another kind of expression of anti-Semitism. So these are the sort of ways that it's being perceived in the Israeli public. I'm not necessarily saying that it's means that people who are objecting the government or objecting Netanyahu will rally around it, but definitely it's not perceived as something that is helpful in terms of shaping public opinion or making people in Israel more aware or more reflexive about what's their part or their responsibility. When it comes to academic boycott, and this is again, I'm feeling in a way unease at saying that, because, you know, obviously I do have, I'm not a, sort of an, you know, it affects me directly as an Israeli academic. But it's, I mean, I can only reflect my, you know, my own kind of experience of that. And I would say that in a way, Israeli universities, and especially professors in social sciences and humanities, are being targeted by the government for the past decade and a half at least. We're being, it's either, you know, having sort of portraying us as kind of the enemy within, or actually trying to take kind of legislative measurements in order to narrow or restrict again the boundaries of the legitimate discourse, and also sanction academics. So there are two. There is one very important piece of legislation that is currently under discussion. It's already passed the first calling in the Knesset, and this is that it says that the universities will have to fire without any kind of due process any university professor who will be accused of supporting terrorism. Now, on the face of it, it sounds like, okay, of course. I mean, yeah, no country can allow anyone who supports terrorism to be teaching in a university. But the way that it's framed in this piece of legislation that is being discussed, I mean, first, it's important to say that it's basically a bill that is trying to change the legislation around the autonomy of the Council of Higher Education, which is in itself very problematic and populist move, kind of taking a leaf out of Orban book in Hungary. And but basically it doesn't define what is terrorism, and in that respect, and in the eyes of the government, as I explained before, saying that there is starvation in Gaza, or standing in with photographs of children who lost their lives in Gaza, it's support of terrorism. So if the legislation will pass, someone from a right-wing organization can come and say, like, Halleli Pinson supports terrorism, and the university will be obliged to fire me without any compensation, without my pension, by the way. And if the university won't fire me, then it will the government will cut its budget. So this legislation hasn't passed. It probably won't pass as harsh as I'm saying it now, but this has a cooling effect. And again, right-wing organizations like Im Tirtzu and others are being targeting university professors, not just for, you know, what I teach or not teach in the classroom, but also for not me personally in that respect, but what I write on my Facebook page, demanding universities to fire professors who, you know, don't say the right thing. And obviously it puts, and there's a similar legislation that try to restrict the activities of students, and it's obviously put also our Palestinian professors and students at even greater risk than it puts me or people who is identified as a left-winger. So this is, so I'm saying all this to say that in a way, it feels like in the past year, we are being attacked by our colleagues abroad for not taking enough action and not taking enough responsibility, and the calls for boycotting is getting, you know, stronger and stronger. But at the same time, I think I'm not sure how the international community understand that we are being also attacked from within, and are for speaking out about, you know, what's going on in Gaza. And that I'm not sure boycotting us will actually make a difference in terms of policy, because I mean, this government has its vendetta against universities to begin with. And definitely, if I have less of power within Israel, and I have to worry about, you know, what's, you know, my collaboration outside Israel, then my ability to influence is, it's a question whether it's growing or being reduced. And I think that's sort of a catch-22 that is problematic in a sense of the calls for boycotting and sanctioning Israel. The question really whether it's effective, and I'm not sure how effective it is.
Right. And lastly, Professor Pinson, looking beyond the immediate conflict, how might the Gaza war transform Israeli political culture, intergroup relations, and trust in democratic institutions? Do you foresee the entrenchment of a security-oriented populist paradigm, or is there potential for a societal reimagining and reconciliation?
So I would say that I'm very much encouraged by the growing discourse in Israel against the war. And this is, I mean, it's growing. And as I said, this is something that you do see an evolution in the past you know, I would say 6 months, even more, past year. But I think beside, you know, the question of whether, I mean, I'm quite certain that at one point the war will end, as war tend to. But I think the damage that has been created to Israeli society also internally, both in terms of, you know, what will happen when people actually will realize what has been going on in Gaza, or will come to terms with that, or denial won't be possible anymore. But also in terms of the sort of the rift that has been created between, that is being even more profound, between those who support the continuation of the war and those who don't, between the heads of the right-wing parties, or the supporters, and some of the more mainstream public. The sort of the level of animosity and hatred that is being kind of created between these two camps. I would say that I'm not very optimistic, and I think it's going to take a generation to kind of shift the discourse to a more sort of liberal mainstream discourse.
Professor Pinson, thank you very much for your time. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much. Thank you.